I've never seen a group together of 30 bears out here, but you do see bears wrestling and sparring is what we call it. So it's a type of wrestling that they do where they
Right.
stand up on their back feet and they'll push on one
Yeah.
another.
Hello, and welcome to another AMA where we're asking polar bear researcher Dylan McCart your questions about one of the coolest creatures in the Arctic. Hi, Dylan.
Hi there. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Thank you for joining us. So, how did you get into polar bear research?
Well, I've been studying polar bears for about 14 years now. It actually started here in Churchill with my undergrad. I was enrolled in a field course where I was able to come up to Churchill, be relocated into a bird banding station, and actually get to study bears in the wild, which was
Wow.
life-changing for me. Since then, I've been involved with some conservation roles and human-bear interactions within Northern Ontario. With that work, I was then accepted into my master's program at York University, studying polar bear endocrinology, so studying polar bear hormone production. And just over 2 years ago, I accepted the role as executive director of the Churchill Northern Studies Centre. So really came full circle.
Wow, that's amazing. That sounds like you have many, many stories about polar bears.
I do.
So, what do you do now at the research center? What does your job entail?
So, as an executive director, I oversee all operations for the research center. We're located about 23 kilometers outside of the town of Churchill. We are a nonprofit independent research station that runs full year. So we have researchers that come on site. We welcome guests for multi-day programs, and we house academic groups as well, so school groups and extracurricular groups. So oversee all of that with the amazing staff that I have.
That's awesome. Sounds like a lot of things are happening there and a lot of really cool things. Yeah. How close have you been to a polar bear?
Over the last decade, I've worked with bears in the field and I've worked with bears in human care. I collect samples from them, so morphometric samples, measurements, physical samples, blood samples, hair samples, tissue samples. So in order to do that, we need to be in contact with the bears. So majority of the time, the bears are sedated. However, I've worked with bears in human care. We're able to work with them as they participate and voluntarily provide samples for us. So pretty close.
Wow. So they're just like used to interacting with humans and they're pretty chill about it.
It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of training, positive reinforcement, where you create a bond with some of these individual bears where they trust you and they're able to voluntarily provide specific parts of their body, like their paws, where we can take measurements of their paws or blood samples, and they actively participate. So it's been very interesting.
That's amazing. And it sounds also a little bit terrifying as well. Um, how big are their paws actually?
Well, their paws can reach about 30 inches in length, so pretty big.
And I've heard that they have blue tongues. Is that true?
It can appear that they're blue. So polar bears will change pigmentation throughout their life. When they're first born, they're completely pink skin. Over time, they start to change that coloration where it turns black. And as an adult polar bear, they have completely black skin. But that coloration can also change within their mouths too. So we see that at the top of polar bears' mouths or their lips, and that also happens in their tongues too. So it changes per individual, but you can see bears with completely pink tongues. You can see polar bears with completely black tongues. And then there's a marbled effect that kind of makes it appear to be purplish or blue.
Oh, whoa, that's really cool. I know my dog
Yeah,
has a bit of like a little bit of black on it and but mostly pink. So it's kind of cool that polar bears have the same effect as well. But the purple is a little bit cooler.
yeah, it's pretty interesting to see.
For sure. Another question we received is, can polar bears breed with other bear species?
They can. So polar bears share a common ancestor with brown bears about 200,000 years ago. It sounds like a very long time, but on an evolutionary basis, it's really not. So polar bears and brown bears can breed and have fertile young, meaning that their young can continue on to breed and have offspring. So we have a few documented sightings of the hybrid that we call either Pizzly bear or a Growler bear.
Oh, those are really cool names. Do you have a favorite between those two names?
I think it depends on if the female is a polar bear or a brown bear. So depending on the
Okay.
breeding pair, that's where the name derives from.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
yeah, so the hybrid that we see has very characteristic features. Some brown bears will have a very light color phase where they're almost blonde, and it appears to be a hybrid, but the actual hybrids that we have documented have characteristic circles around their eyes, kind of like glasses. They
Oh,
have the hump like a brown bear. They've got mostly um, white fur like a polar bear, and they have more of a structure of a polar bear as well. So it's very interesting to see. It doesn't happen too frequently, but there have been documented sightings of them.
yeah, I was going to ask, like, how many of these hybrids are there?
Well, of all the hybrids that we have documented, we have been able to do genetic analysis that a majority of these bears are actually linked back to a single female polar bear that
Oh,
had chosen to breed with brown bears.
interesting.
So it's pretty interesting. Yeah, it
Yeah,
really defines how each polar bear specifically is really an individual. They can
yeah.
vary quite a bit.
And how does this hybrid affect their survival in the wild?
So, like I mentioned, a lot of the documented hybrids that we've seen have it was a female polar bear that bred with a male brown bear. What we know of polar bear life cycle, a polar bear cub will stay with their mom for about 2 or 3 years. During that time, that hybrid offspring will be brought up as a polar bear, learn how to survive as a polar bear, and eventually continue on to breed with other polar bears. And then eventually those genes are kind of just bred out.
Okay, all right. So it
Mhm.
doesn't seem like we'll get more and more hybrid
No,
bears.
there has been theories that with the negative effects of climate change that
Mm,
hybrids are increasing, but that's not necessarily the case. It's something that we've seen for a very long time, and the pace at which climate change is affecting polar bears, it doesn't seem like a viable option to adapt towards.
okay, yeah, that's actually really good to know because yeah, I've heard those stories of, this is what climate change is doing. So it's interesting to hear like the research side of that story. And kind of this makes a good segue because a few years ago there was like a viral video of a polar bear petting a dog, and people thought it was really, really cute. But then there were also people were saying, wait, that actually isn't as cute as you might think. So, sort of, do you have a take on that viral video?
Yeah, there's been quite a few videos and pictures of polar bears interacting with dogs in close proximity. And a majority of those pictures and videos are actually from Churchill. So there was a dog yard of dog sleds just outside of Churchill that lived on the tundra. They weren't displaced, they just lived there, they ate there. And often polar bears would come towards the dogs, potentially smelling the food that they were given or just smelling the dogs themselves. And like we already talked about, polar bears are very distinct and different, very diverse as individuals. So, depending on their overall body condition, if they're skinny, if they have a healthy amount of fat on them, it can depend how they interact with other animals. So, for instance, if we see a fat, happy bear that is just looking to interact with the bear or with a dog, you'll see pictures of them playing and kind of wrapping their paws around them and being very gentle.
Mm,
Um, However, it happens the opposite as well,
mm,
where bears that are in worse body conditions, so skinnier, that are trying to consume any resources that they have killed dogs in our area as well. So
right.
I think with those pictures and videos, we see it's kind of biased. We see one side of it, where in reality, both things happen.
It's the not always so black and white, and that's important to remember. So thank you for that. That was
No
very
problem.
insightful. That also leads to the next question of like how dangerous really are polar bears. You hear the phrase of like what to do when you see a black bear and a brown bear and then a polar bear. Like it's a polar bear, you're done. So like yeah, what do you do if you see a polar bear?
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded question. They are a large animal. They are top of the food chain, right? They're built to survive. They have a massive head with huge jaw muscles that can have a compression of like 1200 psi. They can crush bones. For any large animal interacting with humans, there's a potential that that could go wrong. I've found in my experience that I've kind of fought that stereotype that polar bears are man eaters or man hunters, because that doesn't necessarily happen. A majority of the documented attacks or interactions with people, it seems to be younger bears that these interactions occur with. So like we mentioned, polar bear cubs will stay with mom for 2 to 3 years. After that, when they separate, this is kind of the time that they're on their own, they're inexperienced, and we see them going for areas where you see interactions with humans. So if they smell human settlements, like if they're smelling food, if they're smelling garbage, if they're smelling anything like that, they're not experienced enough not to go towards that. So that does happen. We also see instances of older bears that may be skinnier or ill, that where that's occurred as well. But that's just the same as any other animal. To address polar bears being man eaters, it doesn't really make sense. Polar bears rely on a very high fat diet. And in order for polar bears to sustain their weight, they need that high fat diet that they get. And a human wouldn't necessarily do that. And in my experience, I would not say that polar bears are overly aggressive than any other bear species.
One thought that came up when you were talking is just like how they're like any other animal. I was thinking about humans as well. Like when we first move away from home, we're a little bit more rebellious, a little more risky.
Exactly.
So what do they eat to maintain their fat?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Polar bears heavily rely on a meal of seals throughout the winter months. Seals specifically because they have quite a bit of body fat. They have blubber on them that is very high in calories, so they need that high caloric intake. Addressing the time of year that polar bears can hunt for seals would be in the winter months. They need that sea ice platform in order to hunt for seals. So with that time frame throughout the winter months, they gain as much weight as they possibly can until the summer months when the sea ice will melt in our area where bears are forced onto land. And they go a few months without eating. They can go up to 5 months without eating.
Oh, wow. So that means they don't necessarily hibernate the way that other bears would.
No, technically, polar bears are not true hibernators. So, true hibernators would lower their metabolic rate, their heart rate would decrease, their body temperature would decrease. And the only time that we see something similar to that would be female polar bears that create dens in the fall when they have their cubs and then emerge about now. So, in March is when they emerge from that. They don't technically hibernate, but they do go through a state of lethargy. So a lot slower moving. They're not consuming any food. They're just waiting in their dens. They have their young. They feed their young and then finally head out to try and get some seals before the sea ice melts again.
And how long do polar bears live, actually?
Females will live roughly 25 years in the wild, where males will live around 20 years. And that's due to competition. Male polar bears will compete during breeding season, and a lot of times it's a lot high conflict where bears will fight, sometimes with fatal injuries for females, and that's why we see a decreased lifespan in males.
You mentioned your research in sort of like the hormonal system in polar bears. What is one of the most interesting things that you've found about polar bears that many people might not know about?
So one misconception is that polar bears are completely solitary animals. With my research, I focused on testosterone production in male polar bears. Within the last decade, we've been able to identify testosterone trends throughout the year, how that varies. Reproductive physiologists in Cincinnati were able to identify that male polar bears will have an increase in testosterone around February, March, and April, where their testosterone levels increase tenfold. For the remainder of the year, their testosterone decreases where it stays at a steady state that we call baseline. About 6 months after that, polar bears will likely be on land where they're just waiting for the sea ice to form again, and they just want to go back out and eat. And just next to us at the Churchill Northern Studies Centre, we have the Wapuss National Park, where we have researchers that go out and will collect information about the polar bears in our areas. And in the summer months, when the testosterone is at baseline levels, you'll see groups of males of up to 30 lounging on one another, playing with one another, hanging out with one another. It's really interesting to see because, like I said, there's that misconception that they're solitary animals and that they don't actually interact with one another.
That's kind of heartwarming. When you see photos of polar bears, are usually by themselves, maybe with their cubs, if it's the mama bear. I can't really remember seeing a photo of just like 30 bears just hanging out. So that's really awesome.
Yeah, it does happen throughout the summer months, like I said, while they're waiting.
Yeah.
But like we talked about, they rely on that sea ice platform to hunt for their main source of food, which is typically ring seals. In our area, they consume bearded seals or harbor seals as well, but they just can't do that throughout the summer months. So they'll wait around, and while they're doing that, they're happy enough to hang around with one another. They do feed on a terrestrial diet throughout the summer. So if they find bird eggs, berries, or if they find a carcass, they'll consume that. But like I said, it just doesn't sustain their weight.
Right.
There was, I think it was the record high for a congregation of polar bears. It was actually in Russia where there was a large whale carcass and there was a congregation of over 200 polar bears that were consuming this whale at one time.
Wow.
And you can link that again to their hormonal trends that we see. So throughout the
Right.
winter months when they're hunting for seals, that testosterone is higher. So they're staying solitary and they're competing over a food source. But in the summer months when their testosterone is low, they're able to be in close proximity and actually share a food source.
Wow. Yeah. 200 bears just happily sharing a whale. That's that's
Imagine, yeah.
incredible. Yeah. Wow. Okay. Sorry, I'm still like processing just all of these polar bears hanging out together. And have you accidentally stumbled on a bunch of polar bears hanging out with each other?
I've seen it in the wild.
Okay.
Stumbling on a bunch of polar bears, not necessarily. The Churchill Northern Studies Centre sits within the Churchill Wildlife Management Area, where it's a protected area. We see bears coming through on our property quite a bit, but actually just towards the bay, just north of us, it is very popular tourist area where people will come and visit the polar bears through the fall. So October, November is our bear season. The bear season is created from this large congregation of polar bears. This is when, right before the sea ice forms, this is when the polar bears move towards the shore and they wait for the sea ice to form. I've never seen a group together of 30 bears out here, but you do see bears wrestling and sparring is what we call it. So it's a type of wrestling that they do where they
Right.
stand up on their back feet and they'll push on
Yeah.
one another.
It's very
And
playful.
yeah, very playful, very interactive. Again, each bear is individual, so some bears like playing more than others. But it's an important time for polar bears because they have been mostly sedentary. They're not moving very much throughout the summer months. And this active time when it's a little bit cooler, where they're not going to overheat, it's going to get their bodies ready to go back out on the sea ice and travel thousands of kilometers throughout the winter season to hunt for seals and for breeding season.
Gosh, it's like their little warm-up season.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I like that. And how do they know when the sea ice is like good for them to go on? Do they test it or do they just instinctively know?
Yeah, they do test it. With my time in Churchill, I've noticed that there's a distinct time that you see a higher density of bears along the coast. So since we're on the tundra, we have muskeg and we've got to have a lot of little lakes and ponds. As the temperatures start to drop right before the sea ice forms, you see a lot of those lakes and ponds freeze over, which makes an easier path for bears that are further inland to walk towards the shore. So at that time, I've seen a higher density of polar bears along the coast. And then as soon as that sea ice forms, honestly, within 24 hours, a majority of bears will be out on the ice because all they want to do is go out and hunt.
Then that leads me to the next question of can we safely and sustainably, ethically see polar bears? And if so, how do we do that?
Yes, absolutely. So polar bears are found in the circumpolar area, so in the north along the Arctic. But Churchill, Manitoba, has been named the polar bear capital for a reason. Like I said, we have a high density of polar bears at a specific time of year, and the tourism industry in Churchill, we have many visitors that come and safely view polar bears in our area. For us at the Churchill Northern Studies Centre, we welcome guests for our multi-day programs. They will be able to come up to the center, stay on site with us for about 6 days. We have our extremely knowledgeable polar bear expert researchers that will instruct the entire program, where you get to learn everything you possibly want to know about polar bears and actually get to go out onto the tundra and view them in the wild.
That sounds like an amazing experience.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely something to look into for sure. And so then what do you do when you're going outside of the center and you do see a polar bear? What's your like plan of action in that moment?
For Churchill specifically, because we know we have a high density of polar bears, we have quite a bit of support from the province in a program called the Polar Bear Alert Program, where we have conservation officers that monitor our area and ensure that any polar bears that are coming towards our town, that they're managed properly. So we try to deter bears as much as possible. We have preventative methods of proper waste management and continual training with our locals here. So we're actually located within the wildlife management area, and we're permitted to be in this spot specifically. So with that, we're categorized as a priority one, meaning that any bears that interact with our center or any human settlements that we have out here, we want to actively deter them from being habituated or accustomed to being around people. So
Mm.
we have staff training and we have specific individuals that are trained as polar bear guards. So that is specific experience that you have within polar bear territory and specific training as well.
Oh wow, that's really cool to be like, I'm
Mm-hmm.
a polar bear guard. What are the roles that polar bears play in sort of climate change and conservation research and policies?
Yeah, that's a good question. Polar bears are seen as kind of an iconic species for the negative impacts of climate change. So within even last year, we had record high temperatures, and that drastically impacts the sea ice that forms. So the sea ice that forms in the Arctic Ocean over a specific period of time, we call the sea ice extent. So as we see an increase in temperature, we see a decrease in sea ice extent. And the way that this affects polar bears is that they rely on that sea ice to hunt for their main source of food, which is seals. Without that high caloric diet, we see bears that are skinnier. We categorize that as a body condition. And there's 5 separate stages that we typically see with bears, from 1 being very skinny to 5 being very fat. And as we see temperatures increase and sea ice extent decrease, we also see a decrease in body conditions of polar bears. So they've become this iconic species that is really the true indicator of how climate change can affect a single species, but we can see issues with how that affects people, places, and animals all over the world.
They are definitely an iconic species. Would you say that they're kind of like an indicator species for climate change?
Yeah, they can be, because they're top of the food chain. That could be an indicator of issues with species that they feed on or that their prey feeds on as well. So they would be identified as an indicator species. Absolutely.
They sound like a very important species then, and I'm glad we have dedicated researchers for them. It's almost time to wrap up. So before we do that, I just want to ask a few fun questions about polar bears. Um,
Sure.
I've seen this on the internet, so I'm just wondering, do polar bears have a smell since you've been so close with them?
Well, it depends on the time of the year. So in the
Okay.
summer months, polar bears can sweat when they can perspire, and they have that kind of musty smell.
Okay.
But in general, in the winter months, they really don't have much of a smell at all. If anything, I
Oh,
would say it's more similar to sea salt, seawater. You can really smell that on them,
oh.
unless they, recently had a meal or a kill where you have some distinct smells on them. But typically, they don't really smell too much.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that I
Hmm.
thought they would definitely have some sort of like musky smell, but okay, good
Yeah.
to know. And do you have like a favorite fun fact about polar bears to share?
There's a few things that I think people don't know about polar bears. One, they have a third eyelid.
Oh,
Yeah, they have a third eyelid that we can see when polar bears are swimming underwater. It could be used protection in the harsh climate when they have wind and snow blowing at them. Polar bears have partially webbed toes as well, so
that's
it
cool.
really helps them swim. And one thing that I feel like is more well known now, but polar bears actually don't have white fur. Their fur is completely transparent. It lacks any pigmentation. But when it's layered on one another, it kind of has that white appearance.
You mentioned before that their skin is actually black, right?
Hmm.
That means there must be a lot of layers of fur then.
Yeah, throughout the winter months, they have two very thick layers of fur that we longer hairs that are called guard hairs, and then a shorter, curlier fur that we call their insulative fur. So that helps them throughout the harsh winter months that they thrive out here. And in the summer months, they actually go through a molting process where they'll lose some fur and grow a completely new fur throughout the summer months.
So do you see like random bits of polar bear fur on the ground sometimes?
We do. We absolutely do. I could say that I have a unhealthy collection of polar bear fur that I found in the wild
Do
farm.
you really? Well, that,
Yeah.
you're gonna have to show a picture of that collection then, now
Yes.
that you've revealed this. Amazing. Thank you so much for your time and for your amazing answers. Lots of cool stories. I've learned so much about polar bears.
Thank you. Thanks again for